In biology, we've been telling a story about individuality now for at least 150 years, that the fundamental stuff of life is the individual gene, the individual species. We live in a culture where we conceive of ourselves as individuals. I have a social security number here in the US. I have a name that was given to me officially and through baptism and so on. It's all very individualistic. And that's a valid and helpful way of looking at the world and living in the world, but it also overemphasizes one aspect, which is atomism and the self, rather than think of the fundamental stuff of life as being relationship.
Welcome to the Passing Through Podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments. I speak with thinkers, authors, artists, teachers, and everyday humans who have touched the edge of the ordinary and found something to bring back. I am coming to you straight from Wrocław, Poland. I am not in my typical recording studio, which is the inside of my Volkswagen Transporter, but I am in the inside of an unfamiliar apartment. We are just back from 10 days of Vipassana meditation, which I'd love to tell you about in excruciating detail, but that's going to have to wait until a future episode, maybe even next week. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the episode that you're about to listen to. This episode is going to begin with a question about 200 million year old milk. That's right. 200 million year old milk. And the howl of a moonlit coyote. It might sound like the start of a strange riddle, but it turns out that those two things are actually intimately connected. And that connection tells a story about where our voices come from. A story that stretches back hundreds of millions of years into deep time, through countless ancestors, into the living, singing earth itself. And joining me today to help excavate questions like these and explore these stories is biologist, award-winning author, and deep listener, David George Haskell. David is a contributor to publications such as the New York Times, Scientific American, and The Guardian, and his books like The Forest Unseen, The Songs of Trees, and Sounds Wild and Broken all explore how life is woven together through sound, scent, story, and relationship. David's work is perched in this wonderful place between science and poetry, where forests aren't just ecosystems, but they become bustling communities. Towards the end of our conversation, we will discuss David's upcoming book, How Flowers Made Our World, where he'll reveal how flowering plants reshaped the planet, literally changed our world forever, creating rainforests, grasslands, and also the evolutionary conditions necessary for human life on Earth. Through cooperation, beauty, and sometimes even deception, flowers transformed Earth's ecosystems, and they continue to sustain the vast webs of life all around us. This is one of those episodes where I wish I had another hour, or even 2, or maybe even 3, to continue picking David's brain, but I'll have to save that for the future episode. I really loved this conversation with David, and I hope you do too. All of the links that you'll need to find him and his upcoming book, How Flowers Made Our World, will be in the show notes. As always, be good to one another. I will talk to you next time. And now, go grab yourself a warm bottle of milk and let's get lost in the sauce. Okay, David George Haskell, welcome to the Passing Through podcast.
Thank you, Danny. It's great to join you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to sit down with you because you are at this interesting intersection of biology, poetry, animist relationality, and kinship. And I'm eager to dig into those things. But first, I had a question inspired by your sound and spoken word project, When the Earth Started to Sing, which I really enjoyed. Can we begin by talking about the fascinating connection between 200 million year old milk and the howl of a moonlit coyote?
Yeah, great question. And yes, indeed, there is a connection. We think of sound as being just of the moment and very ephemeral. And of course, that's one of the beauties of sound is that little sound waves travel from a bird or from a tree to our ears, and then that experience is of the moment and then it's gone. But sound also has this deeper history of causalities. And in my book, Sounds Wild and Broken, I tried to uncover some of those causalities and some of those connections and ask, what did the Earth sound like 400 million years ago? And when did the Earth first started to sing? And the audio essay that you're referencing was one that I did with Emergence Magazine, and Matt Mickelson was a sound designer on that. So it was a real collaborative project with him and Emmanuel Vaughan Lee. And so it's not just me, I want to say. um, and one of the connections that we drew out in that little journey through the sounds of the earth was that the human voice and the voice of howling wolves and coyotes and squeaking mice and purring cats all comes from our voice box, right? Which is down in our throat, these little membranes and folds that vibrate that then get shaped. The sound gets shaped as it comes up through the mouth by the back of the throat and the tongue and the teeth. And it's this incredible, complex, I mean, mostly we don't think about it, right? But we're shaping sound in these very, very sophisticated ways to make vowels and consonants and string them together in words in the way that I'm doing now. Mammals are some of the few creatures that can do that. Why? Because we have incredibly complex and quite strong musculature in our throat, especially attached to the hyoid bone, which is a little U-shaped bone underneath under the jaw. If you push your finger gently, don't push too hard. If you push your finger gently there, you'll feel the hyoid bone. So we owe our voice to the complex musculature of the throat and the big old hyoid bone that we've got. Well, that didn't evolve first to help us produce sound or to help wolves howl or coyotes yelp at night. It evolved first basically because of the gift of our great, 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 great grandmothers who first evolved lactation. So about 200 million years ago, these primitive mammals, early mammals, evolved the ability to take the mother's nutrition and package it in this incredibly rich substance that we now call milk. And we don't even really think about how amazing it is because it's just in the grocery store. And just, I mean, and we make cheeses so we're in a very lactose-centered culture, or many of us are, at least in the West. But before the evolution of milk, every little baby animal had to feed for itself, right? Go and find seeds or insects. That's really hard. And what these ancient mammal mothers did was say, hey, I'm going to do the hard work of finding all this food for you. And then I'm going to package it in this very easy to digest food that I'm going to deliver to you. And then, of course, that helps the little baby mammals grow very quickly and strong, and their brains can get bigger, and all the great kind of mammalian stuff can happen, all because of lactation. Now, to receive that gift, you need a mouth and the lips and the throat that can actually suckle. And so this is how the mammalian hyoid bone and musculature of the mouth, and particularly the back of the throat, all the things that are involved in speech, how they got complex, sophisticated, strong, nuanced in mammals was first through the gift to receive the gift of lactation of milk from ancient mothers. The evolution then repurposed that, and it's like, wow, I mean, I'm personifying evolution a bit here, not just a bit, a lot. I mean, evolution doesn't, as far as we know, think in this sort of way. It's much more happenstance, anarchic process. But here are these creatures that suddenly at the top of their vocal tract, they have this really complex set of muscles and bones. Let's put that to use, evolution says, and boom, you get the extraordinary diversification and elaboration of mammalian sounds. Very evocative things like wolves howling, things that we can't even hear, like the ultrasonic squeaks of rats and mice.
Hmm.
And then, of course, the things that connect us, which is our human voices. And of course, human language is one of the pinnacles of complexity of sonic communication. I mean, we're learning more and more how other non-human species are actually quite complex as well. But let's not diminish the achievement of our own ancestors to just shape sound into words that can convey philosophical meaning or emotion or very precise instructions for how to build a tool, all by little wavering bits of quivering air. It's like, if we didn't have this method of communication, we think it would be ridiculous. That's not going to work, but it does. And one of the creatures we have to thank are our great, 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 great grandmothers, the proto mammals. We also have ancient insects to thank, and there's a whole other series of causalities going deeper into time. But my hope is with that essay and my book and the other work is to help people think about sound in a way of as a little portal into deep time and into connection with ancestors and stories from long, long ago, which enriches our experience of the moment.
Yeah, thank you. That I love that so much. I love everything about that. The connection to ancestors, deep time, story, these traditions that we are often sort of severed from, that there's this kind of fracture where we
Mhm.
lost this sense of relationship to these things. And what I like about your work in particular is that you draw attention to these things. You try to reconnect them. And this is important work and beautiful work. And yeah, I just want to thank you for that work here at the start because
Well, thank you.
yeah, and even as you're speaking now, you're activating things in me where I'm sensing how incredible of a thing sound is, where literally through vibration, we can enter into relationship with the air and take something that's encased in our skull or in our heart and vibrate it with our organism out across like an invisible gaseous divide, literally into the skull of one or more people who are listening.
Yep,
It's like magic.
it is. I mean, I think of it almost like it's a little bit telepathic, right? So one point of consciousness. I mean, I don't know if consciousness exists in points or anyway, but at least in my experience with my own head, it seems like, okay, I've got my consciousness going on here. And when I'm speaking or when I'm listening to others at a distance and almost immediately, I'm connected to the texture of someone else's conscious experience. And of course, it's not instantaneous. There is a slight delay because sound travels, we hear this in echoes and so on. So, but it feels instantaneous. And the amazing thing with speech and song is it doesn't really actually take that much effort to produce this signal. And yet it will travel several meters. And if you're really shouting, it can go all the way across a mountain valley uh, in a way that other forms of communication, which are also really important, like visual signaling, the expressions on our faces or how we move our hands, or aromas, whether they're the aromas produced by our body or the perfumes that we apply, which is another form of interspecies connection that I find fascinating. Um, those act at close range, whereas sound is like, woo, is going a long way. And, we are by far not the most accomplished in that. I mean, think about whales. I mean, they're the most famous, of course, for long distance communication, is that potentially a whale, if it's in the deep sound channel in the ocean, which is sort of basically a deep lens that takes sound and carries it from one edge of the ocean to the other. So a whale could be hearing another whale saying hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Now, the extent to which they actually do that is sort of open to debate because most whales are really they're in conversation with the other whales that are right around them, right? But in theory, they can communicate certainly their sound travels that far, and it connects them into this sort of more global sense of, what are the humpback whales on the other side of the Pacific saying right now? And in a way, there's a kind of a cultural fashion element to this because whales don't just sing a song and that's it. The song changes over the years and over the decades, and different songs come in and out of fashion, and they seem to originate in one part of the Pacific and then spread out to other parts of the Pacific. In a way, this is quite analogous to human culture, right? So that someone comes up with a really cool way of making music, or a lick, or a riff, or just an individual song, and then it spreads through human culture. But then usually it dies out after a few weeks, or if it's a really great one after a few decades or centuries. And whales are doing similar things. Of course, they're in their own whale headspace and culture. I don't want to claim to anthropomorphize them too much, but there is a parallel there that is all mediated by sound.
Yeah, that's that's also fascinating. And as you were speaking, I thought of an analog between the behavior of whales there stretching out these songs over time and the song lines of, let's say, Aboriginal cultures in Australia,
Yep.
which are kind of doing the same thing on a human time scale. But the whale time scale seems much more interesting than humans because they live much longer than we do.
Yeah, they're used to. I mean, the issue with whales is, of course, that the population. Well, humpbacks actually in some places have come back to almost their former population levels. But many other whales are a tiny fraction of what they used to be. And
Mm.
ship strikes and the problems of ocean noise and pollution are shortening their lives. So they can, depending on the species of the whale, they can, like bowhead whales, maybe centuries. Other whales, it's a shorter lifetime. But I do think cultures that have been in place on a particular landscape, like the many, many different cultures in Australia that use sound and, of course, the oral tradition to orient on the land and to orient towards meaning and so on. And I don't want to presume to understand song lines. And I think my understanding is there's been some oversimplification maybe by some of us in the West about the nuance and the complexity and the cultural diversity within that tradition. But certainly oral storytelling and vocalizing the land through song and language is a big part of relation to the land and identity that most likely goes back tens of thousands of years, as do all human cultures, right? I mean, so I'm speaking in English now. English is a more recent invention, but you trace the words back, and even in English and the cultures of the West, we are inheritors of traditions that go back tens of thousands of years in Europe as well, with a lot more fragmentation and a lot more disjunction, I would say, in our relationship to the land in particular.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was something that I was noticing I'm reading your book right now, The Songs of Trees,
Mhm.
and this is something that I was noticing very early on when you're in the Amazon, speaking about the relationship between the forest and the people that are there, and that the forest isn't seen as some abstract, disconnected thing where it's just made of a bunch of little objects, but it's like a subject-subject relationship where the forest is full of spirits and ancestors and relationship and voices, and this connection there is intact, that they haven't severed this connection to land in the way that we have.
Yeah, and that's again, with that, I mean, I was lucky enough to meet with a number of people representing various indigenous communities in the Amazon. And, as a writer, I don't want to be presenting, oh, I'm going to explain this person's culture for you, because that's not at all my role. But instead, I mean, what I chose to do in that book is to have some quotes, fragments of conversation, and so on to get a sense of the edges of how other people think about their relation to the land and to the forest. And, one particular example that really struck me and stuck with me was in one part of Ecuador. So this is eastern Ecuador. In the western part of the Amazon, there's a research station called Tipotini Research Station, where people have done a lot of great scientific research, and a lot of students go there to learn about the forest and to learn about how people relate to the forest. And on that research station, as is true in a lot of tropical areas, there is a series of ladders. It's almost like it's more like a scaffolding with nice sturdy ladders going up all the way up to the very top of the tree, the ceibo tree, which is one of the giant trees. And so you can go up there and observe the frogs and the birds and the lichens and the orchids. And it's a method of study, but also of opening people's, particularly students, to the wonder of the forest, because most of the action in the tropical rainforest is up in the canopy. If you're down on the ground, it's like, well, there's some stuff going on there, but a lot of the species is up in the canopy. And, I thought this is great. This is a totally appropriate way of understanding the forest. And one of the people whose relatives had been involved in building that ladder, who is a member of in one of the indigenous communities there, the Warani, was like, that ladder is such a violation of our relationship with the forest, because it's sort of making the human mind and curiosity really penetrate to the heart of the forest in ways that are just, my understanding was it's just too easy, too everyday, because you can just walk up this ladder and hang out there and then walk back down. And whereas for the Warani to go up into the canopy involves risking your life to climb up the tree, and they're extremely good at doing this, but it's a dangerous thing. It requires a commitment of the body, of the spirit, of the intellect, and a deep level of respect for the tree.
Mm.
Whereas the ladder, I would argue that a lot of people, Westerners, leave that ladder with an enormous respect for the tree and newfound wonder and some kind of, but I'm a Westerner, I would think that, right? So, uh, um, but for me, it was, okay, this isn't just about the ladder, it's about two different ways about thinking of what respect means and what relationship to the forest means. And that in Western science in particular, we have this idea that if we can bring a ladder or a crane or a DNA sequencer or even something as simple as, hand lens into the forest and learn stuff about the forest, then that's our right. We should just do that. And often we dress that up in the language of conservation. We're helping to understand biodiversity so we can protect the forest. And I think that's a legit argument. But there's another view that's like, no, you start with respect and building relationship. And of course, for indigenous communities, that relationship isn't just about an individual's relationship with the forest. It's centuries, even millennia of cultural knowledge about how to relate and how to behave in the forest that is often very, very utilitarian, right? If you smell this or if you dream this other thing, don't do this other thing. Don't go hunting today or don't
Mm-hmm.
touch that plant, because it's about putting food on the table and finding medicine and staying in right relations. So it's not all in this ethereal kind of what in the West we'd call spiritual. It's very earthy and oriented towards practical aims, but in doing so, people deeply respect dreams, deeply respect the possibility of relationship existing in ways other than the more kind of extractivist scientific view that a lot of Western scientists, myself included, were educated in.
Yeah, yeah, I like this. This is getting it to the heart of something I wanted to discuss with you, which is this idea that, for me at least, when I look at modern science, I feel as though it's lost some of its sensory intimacy with the world, or it's lost its etiquette. And it has this kind of detached, clinical, observer, extractivist perspective that lost all sense of those more spiritual protocols and this aspect of relationship. And when I read your work, I have more of a sense that you, and maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. You seem to be able to hold both of those things, where you are a man of science, but I get the sense that you have reverence and understanding of these principles and ideas. And I wonder how did you come to that perspective?
Um, well, I honestly don't think I'm the person to make that judgment. I think the forest and other people might be able to comment on my sense of whether I have any reverence or not. But yes, I do try and, I mean, respect is a really, really important thing for me, and it has been since I was a kid. I mean, it really upset me as a kid when other kids would go and like kill insects around in the schoolyard for
Yeah.
entertainment. Or, in fact, I have wrote an essay about the sort of the way in which biology education, particularly through the process of dissection and objectification of animals, really actually excludes a lot of people from scientific study. Because if you regard frogs as wondrous beings that you don't want to stick electrodes into, and your professor is like, no, you have to do this or you quit the class, that's a huge barrier and an unnecessary one. It's like, okay, if you're training to be a neurosurgeon and in an advanced degree, I can see that you would need to mess around maybe with some human and perhaps non human nervous systems, right? Like if anyone does brain surgery in my head, I want them to maybe practice on the frog, and I would feel bad for the frog and also give thanks for the frog. But for a bunch of 14-year-olds to go through that, most of whom are not going to be neurosurgeons, to me that seems a, a, a- an education in cruelty and
Mm.
an education in objectification, rather than if we're going to study frogs, well, what frogs live in our neighborhood? And let's learn their songs and their ecologies. And maybe we can find some in the creek down behind the schoolyard or something like that. That seems like a lot more respectful and honestly more interesting, multi-sensory engagement with frogness than having a half-dead frog that you stick electrodes into. I do think, though, there's sort of a dichotomy within science, is my impression, that yes, some of the really old school objectification, viewing humans as totally outside the rest of the community of life, putting nature on the rack, as Francis Bacon said, all those centuries ago. That is still present. But I also think, particularly in the last decade or two, there are a lot of practicing scientists who have deep, deep respect for the creatures and the ecosystems that they're working with, and have done actually really good work about how do we bring this into education and into our own research practices. For example, even the idea of, hey, yeah, I'm going to go and take measurements from this alpine meadow to understand how climate change is affecting it. But first, I'm just going to sit with the meadow and maybe even ask permission to be here or give
Mm.
thanks for being here. And in no way does that erode the objectivity of science. People are still going to go and take their standardized measurements, which I think are, it's organized curiosity. It's a good way of knowing the world. And honestly, it's a good thing that there are people who are measuring how plant communities respond to climate change in alpine meadows, because that helps us steer a better course, I hope, in terms of being good kin on this planet. But to do so in a way that is trying to befriend the world, that is respectful, I see more and more and more of that and bring that into the classroom as well. So I think in a way that's a hopeful thing, even around language, right? So in plant ecology, there's a lot of concern about plants that come from other continents that push out plants that are indigenous to a particular place. Like, so in the southeastern United States, for example, kudzu, privet, bittersweet, these are plants mostly from Asia that we humans, mostly Westerners, brought over to North America. And now that, they can smother other plants that have been living here for hundreds of thousands, if not longer, of years. And so there's a management question of how do we maintain native biodiversity? The old way of referring to those non-native plants was that they are invaders. and that we hate them and that we need to annihilate them. And it's all this sort of language that it might as well be coming from the Trump's ICE, right?
Mm.
That is, I mean, it literally is the exact talking about invaders and using the language of hate and all the rest of it. And to me, within the ecological community, there's now an active discussion about what kind of language do we use? How can we be more respectful? So I am in full agreement that in some places we need to manage privet. In fact, I've been involved in projects where we map and then we cut the privet and we take it out of there to particularly in places where there are rare native wildflowers that the privet is smothering out. But I want to approach that project as full of admiration for the privet. Here is this plant that evolved in eastern parts of Asia, and it evolved these particular really tough physiology. It's incredibly flexible. It's actually pretty good food for some birds at some times of the year. And it's doing incredibly well in these particular habitats because we humans brought it in as a hedging plant, right, horticulturally. Uh, so let's be honest about the history and show some admiration for the plant, even as we are engaged in management of removing some of those plants. I mean, we're never going to get rid of all the privet in the southeastern US, but we can certainly engage in some gardening, if you like, to help native species that need some help. And it's not clear exactly where that debate about language is going to end up, but the very fact that people are asking those questions, how can we be respectful? How can we not use the language which is basically racist and xenophobic? How can we not use those languages, but also be true to what I think is the very clear need for humans to be active managers of at least some parts of the landscape to help species that really need our help, like some of the ones that are getting smothered by these species that have arrived from other continents.
Hmm. Yeah, I think those are important distinctions. So thanks for sharing that, because those plants didn't ask to be here, you know? So what you're saying now is showing them some respect and understanding even, or maybe empathy, where it's like
Mhm.
these things are here in a place where they didn't ask to be, and they're spreading, and maybe they're not aware of the impacts this has. But again, we get to that delicate place of, when are we anthropomorphizing too much? And when are we extending agency and intelligence to creatures that do have agency and intelligence?
Mhm.
And this is a tension for me that I wonder how you deal with, because this is probably very alive and active in your field and in your research, and
Mhm.
you as an embodied being. Hmm, how do you walk that line?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the line is mostly in my own life, right? How do I think about other beings? And then that comes out in my writing and teaching and so on. But really, it's just how do I walk through the day? Like I just took a sip of tea. How do I think about the camellia plants? I mean, tea is from camellia. uh, I want to honor the otherness of other creatures, right? So I think there is one way of honoring agency and intelligence in other beings that is a little bit too anthropomorphic. Is that oh, trees are just little humans, and everything is a sort of a version of human consciousness and human agency. I think that impulse is great, and it can be a really great way of telling stories and inviting people into that awareness. And Peter Wohlleben, who's written, a lot of books about particularly the biology of plants, has sometimes been criticized for being too anthropomorphic. His response, which is a totally, good response, is like, well, I am trying to invite other people into understanding that a tree is not a static, almost dead object. A tree is a living being with intention and intelligence and interconnectivity and communication. And I'm going to use human stories to tell that because I'm talking to other humans.
Hmm.
That seems to me very appropriate. It's not the way I write, because for me, say, for example, with trees, the extraordinary things about trees is that how radically other they are. So my intelligence, such as it is a lot of it is knotted up in a cranium.
Mhm.
Some of it is held in the rest of my body. Some of it is in the spaces between me and other people in human culture and our relationships. But it's very centralized, right? And it's very neurocentric. Whereas a tree, trees have memory, they make decisions, they communicate with one another, but they do so in a much more decentralized way. So that each leaf, yes, is in conversation with the rest of the tree, but is also making its own decisions in a more modular way. It's also growing in a more modular way. You cut a branch off a tree, and the tree responds by growing more little mini branches around that. That's not how the human body works at all, regrettably. And so trying to get my head and as a writer, my helping other people get their imaginations into, wow, this strange other world of intelligence and memory that is held in the roots and in the trunk and in this much more loosely woven cloth than the very tight knot that is Homo sapiens. And I think it's marvelous that we live on this planet with very different forms of intelligence of that kind. And of course, fungi have their own form of decentralized intelligence, even more so that the ones that really blow me away are the microbial communities of the ocean,
Hmm.
where many of the little microbes, these are mostly bacterial cells, have gotten rid of most of the essential genes that they need in order to function, which is like, how does that work? Well, it works because of community. It's like one cell specializes on doing the one thing it's good at. Another cell specializes on doing another thing that it's really good at. And they know they're always going to be close together. So they can essentially, biologists call it genetic streamlining. They can lose a lot of the DNA that every other cell on the planet needs in order to function because they know that another cell will do that function for them. And so, in a way, it's like the most kumbaya, commune level kind of vibe you can imagine, but it's also the most Adam Smith free market economics at the same time, right? Each creature specializing on the thing that it does best. And
Hmm.
then through trade, the whole system does really well. So we can look at ocean microbes and read two completely different allegories, one about cooperation and community, and the other about ruthless free market economics. And they're both true at the same time. Right? And that's, to me, that's wonderful. And as a writer, that's really cool because it's sort of this tension, this duality that's interesting to explore. But my basic approach is to try to get my head into the otherness of these beings and I absolutely believe that there's intelligence and memory and decision making and most likely consciousness in most of the rest of the living world. By the rest, I mean the non-human part of it, in that marvelous webbed community. But honestly, until I don't know what happens when we die, but one request I might have if there is life after death is, could I just have my consciousness in an oak tree for a little bit and in an ocean microbe and just to sort of feel what that's like, to experience that from the inside.
Hmm.
And it's a big mystery, and I really do think we need to be agnostic and humble in our projections of what we think is happening, especially at the level of subjective experience and consciousness. Because ultimately, I mean, we can't even get in the consciousness of another human being, let alone, I mean, except indirectly through language and music and MRI machines and things like that. But at the same time, that of course, the scientific move has been, well, let's be agnostic, not just agnostic, but let's deny even the possibility that a tree could have conscious experience or memory or intelligence.
Hmm.
And that's still quite alive within a lot of the scientific community, partly as a reaction to sort of Victorian fairy tales about, oversimplifying and too much anthropomorphizing, and modern science formed in reaction to that, which I think is healthy. You need a good immune response to, like, let's throw out the simplistic projections. But in throwing that out, we then also threw out the possibility that even creatures like, say, our closest relatives, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, might have conscious experience. And of course, many of the researchers, I mean, Jane Goodall, most famously of all, were the ones who opened at least the Western mind to this. It's like, are you kidding? these creatures have brains that are very much structured like ours. Their societies have many parallels. Why wouldn't I mean, the default parsimonious explanation should be that all these other beings, especially those closely related to us, also have similar conscious experiences and intelligence and so on that we do.
Yeah, and even when you look at the anthropological record, and you go way back across time and culture, there are a substantial amount of reports of people entering trance states and communing with other beings or with trees or with animals or even becoming them or like getting a glimpse into what the consciousness
Yep.
of a squirrel might be, or a wolf, or whatever. So you
Mhm,
have
mhm.
reports of this when we were more connected and in more right relationship with the land around us. And I wonder if we've lost some. I wonder what even inspired that rift,
Mhm.
that huge schism there. Do you think it comes from a sense of wanting to control and have safety, and we're sitting there in the darkness and you're prey to predation and you see the madness of the swirls of the stars above and things shooting by and everything just is this chaotic, wondrous world. Did you just want a little more control and safety? And so you try to wall up and then in enough time you get where we are now?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's a big question of exactly how we got where we are, and I think we have to be careful about "we" because I think there are lots across cultures now, there are lots of different ways of conceptualizing and experiencing and living our relationship to what David Abram calls the modern human world. But even within Western culture, there are some very strong differences. Like you compare traditions in England compared to Southern Italy, compared to Scandinavian countries, and I mean, people have quite different notions of that relationality, and it's manifested in different ways, even within, say, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Abrahamic religions, which are not thought of traditionally as animistic. But you read the scriptures, and there are talking trees,
Yeah.
there are birds carrying the spirit. I mean, there's some animistic stuff in there, and particularly the importance of water. And of course, in the Middle East, seasonally arid environment, water isn't just a metaphor for God. Water literally is life. And
Mm.
so, sort of reading those scriptures, even though a lot of them are, I find a little hard to sort of reconcile with our current ecological understanding of the world. But there are ways of reading, and particularly some passages that seem deeply rooted in landscape. And I think part of the task for Westerners is to excavate those ecological roots of our own tradition, as well as respectfully listen to what other cultures are telling us, rather than just trying to import. For example, I'm an Englishman. I need to suddenly import everything that I can from people who live in the Amazon. It's like, well, that's A, it's appropriation. B, it's culturally out of context because I don't live in the Amazon, and therefore the practices in the Amazon maybe don't apply in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live. I need to find things that work here. But the rift, to me, it seems mostly experiential, right? So we can go through our lives, get the food from the grocery store, work inside. Even the weather doesn't really affect most people that much. And so our everyday lives don't have nuanced, granular experiences of different plants and exactly okay, the blue jays are making this particular sound. What does that mean? The soil smells this way today and smelled different a week ago. All of these everyday things that people who live in deeply agrarian or in hunter gatherer or, any context that is outside a lot in relation to other species. There's a lot of just everyday practical connection, most of which isn't transcendent and full of like deep insight into the consciousness of the soil, right? It's just what it is. But as you lose that, all of those thousands, tens of thousands of points of sensory connection, you lose the possibility of then integrating them maybe into special that 0.1% of your life where you might have that special connection to the tree or the wolf or whatever it is. I think trying to get to that 0.1%, I don't know what percentage it is, but some very, very small percent without all the other sets of connection seems unlikely. And it also seems to be maybe self-delusional potentially, right? And this is my sort of, again, agnosticism about my own sense of times when I've had these feelings of real deep connection, of maybe hearing in a weird way what the land is saying and so on. It's like, okay, I'm going to listen to that, but I'm also not going to take myself so seriously that I think that, oh, I'm some kind of great wisdom carrier now because I've heard the blue jay. And honestly, for me, joy is one outcome and it also motivates us. So just making sure that I pay attention to the flowers that are blooming around me or the sound, the subtleties of the sounds of the birds and the textures of leaves, really reconnecting my body, it, opening my senses just to the everyday of other species really, really helps to give me a sense of, wow, this world is actually worth living in. uh, and through those interconnections, I'm feeling something bubbling up that is a guide to right action, maybe, but not in a sense of big voice booming in my head, more of a sense of, okay, I feel like I've tried to pay attention in this community and I belong to this ecological community. Maybe I have something to contribute. Uh, and honestly, that's the foundation of almost all my writing. It's about just opening my senses, whether it's hearing or aroma or texture, and then following those sense impressions back into the stories. For example, listening, we started talking about the human voice. Well, okay, let's listen to the human voice, but let's listen to the stories behind the sounds. Why is it that our throat can shape sounds in such a sophisticated way? Well, it turns out that's a story about our ancestors and how they got to speak the way we speak now. And that's enriching and it gives me a sense of, I guess, belonging.
Mm.
Uh, but it is usually not particularly like floaty or transcendent. I wish it was more. I mean, I would be quite happy to have more ecstatic experience in my life, but that's just really not how it works. It's like these little micro ecstasies of, wow, that was the first hermit thrush of the winter, and that really just made my whole week. Uh,
Thanks for sharing a bit about your process there and what it's like for you. And I'm still curious of what the blue jay said when you were talking about the blue jay, because I guess you're saying you've had experiences where you're in the field and things that you're studying seem to be studying you, maybe, or there's some kind of subversion of this relationship where there's something more mysterious happening than you can make sense of.
yeah, I mean, some of it is. I mean, the first book I wrote, The Forest Unseen, I went to one little patch of forest almost every day for a year and just sat down and shut up for a change, and like just opened my senses to the place. And I really did feel that that place came to know me in the sense that, I mean, the most obvious way is that the animals, like the chipmunks, the birds, didn't freak out when I showed up after a while, right? Because they just, it's that guy wearing the brown jacket. He sits on that rock and it doesn't bother us. So we're just going to go about our lives. So in a way, it's sort of, at first, that wasn't the case at all. They were all kind of freaked out or at least standoffish. But, later in the year, they'd come and, a little bird would sit on my foot or this and that, because as far as they were concerned, this is just boring old tree trunk. Well, I don't know what they were thinking, but I had become part of that community and become known in that place. And at a microbial level, I'm sure my bits of my DNA and so on are still hanging out in those woods. And the sort of revelation, if you like, at that place was stripping back the levels of all the things that were buffering me from actually seeing and hearing. So late in the year, realizing, oh, the quality of the light in this forest has completely changed in the last 2 weeks. Why is that? Oh, it's because the leaves are coming down, and that it was like walking into this whole different universe because the light was different. Because basically the green leaves weren't there sucking up most of the light. And so there were more, the light spectrum was wider, it was brighter, and I could see how the little wildflowers were responding to this. They're putting on a burst of growth, and the birds were displaying in different ways. Yeah, so I just felt I was a lot more present in my senses in that place. In other places, I mean, I guess the most sort of inexplicable set of convergences that I had was in the mountains in Colorado. I'd been sitting with a particular pine tree over many years. This is in a very high meadow up in the mountains, and I took some time off to sit in a different part of the woods, and this was a place where the little squirrels for generations had been caching their pine cones around this one tree. And it produces a pile that is several meters across and a meter or two higher. And it's not just one squirrel doing this, it is generations and generations of squirrels have agreed that this is the tree they're going to use as their cache. And then, of course, as they eat them, they just let the scales fall and it becomes this big compost heap of spruce and pine scales. But, I'd hang out there and it just felt like this node of connectivity because the mule deer would come past. And mule deer up there are kind of skittish usually, but they were super calm, these big bucks with their antlers, just walking right past me and all kinds of other birds coming down from the canopy just to check in. And this is also a place where there was a tree that had been bent down to the ground by the Ute, the indigenous people who were displaced from that land in the 1800s by the Western settlers. But this was a tree that they'd use as a marker pointing towards probably where a spring was located. So as part of their cultural practice, they'd bend young trees and hold them down with rocks or other branches. And then the big tree, and this tree now is, well over 100 years old, the tree is a marker tree. And so for people there, this had also been a place of communication and connection. And, it just felt like this, you know, people have written about thin places and thick places, but this felt like a thin place in that some of those connections seemed very alive to me. And it didn't change my life. It wasn't any real revelation that, oh, I need to quit my job or I need to do this or that. It just was this sense of intellectually, of course, I know that we live in a networked community, that the life is made out of interrelationships. And here I just felt I was really in those relationships, fully alive within them. And that was, um, and it wasn't something I went there to find, right? It just, in fact, I was kind of skeptical. I was like, okay, I'll go hang out in this place, see what's going on. And then suddenly it sort of, these things just manifested. And it was, sort of quiet revelation. Other places, particularly in the Amazon rainforest, are much more emotional, right? The total sensory overload and the sense of incredible beauty and the fact that we are breaking these ecosystems was just, I felt these sense of exaltation and of utter heartbreak at the same time. I mean, I don't often weep when I'm just walking through the woods, but in the Amazon, that certainly did happen several times because it was this extraordinary sense of the potential and the diversity and the beauty of life, but also knowing that this beauty was not secure because of our thoughtless actions, including my own actions. Right, so I'd flown there. And so, I was complicit in all of that. So the emotional layers are complex and are not abstract. They're deeply personal.
I'm just giving that some silence because I can imagine the grief and the heartache, but I can only imagine it. I'm sure that must have felt much more visceral for you being there.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think the nature of grief, whether it's we're grieving a close human relative or a companion animal, or a grief that is maybe more encompassing of like a whole habitat or a place, is deeply mysterious. It emerges sort of out of almost nowhere. We don't know when it's coming on. We don't know what causes it to go away or why we even experience it. Like, what is the point of me going through this grief process? It doesn't, quote unquote, doesn't bring anyone back to life. That's for sure, at least in my experience. And yet it seems a necessary convulsion, catharsis in a storm that is about deep connection. And in a way, the mystery of grief, in a way, what little I know of it in terms of understanding, is this incredibly strong reminder of we are made from connection and relationship. And those connections and relationships are really everything. And when, of course, when they get broken or lost, that tears our being apart. And things manifest within us that we hadn't, that we can't access. We can't just consciously like switch it on, right? I mean, we can do things like play some sad music or put ourselves, go visit the grave or whatever it is. But the grief itself has its own tempo, which to me, I mean, this is maybe a stretch, but actually this is a pretty strong connection in my own head is in biology, we've been telling a story about individuality now for at least 150 years, that the, the fundamental stuff of life is the individual gene, the individual species. You know, we live in a culture where we conceive of ourselves as individuals. I have a social security number here in the US. I have a name that was given to me officially and through baptism and so on. It's all very individualistic. And that's a valid and helpful way of looking at the world and living in the world, but it also overemphasizes one aspect, which is atomism and the self,
Mm,
rather than think of the fundamental stuff of life as being relationship, and that individuals are temporary manifestations of nodes in relationships, nodes in networks of relationships. And so, yeah, I have a name, but that name is temporary, and what persists are the kinship relations and the cultural connections that I make. You know, even things like the periodic table, right? You go into science classroom, and there are the elements literally painted onto the wall as if this was the fundamental reality of life, well, or the world. And I'm not, you know, the periodic table is beautiful and it reveals structures in the world and is predictive and, you know, really very cool in a lot of ways. But it's only one way of looking at the materiality of the world. Because if you look at from the point of view of, say, electrons or energy, electrons and energy have a whole, it's all about relationship and interconnection and different sets of relations that temporarily manifest as, say, a hydrogen atom or a lead atom and so on, that we can then arrange in these rows and columns to pretend that the world is made out of rows and columns. But in fact, it's made out of deeper stuff, which is the relationality from which these atoms are made.
yes.
So it's not that the periodic table is wrong, it's that it's incomplete and that it fits into, and this really rubs me the wrong way, this view, this very kind of spreadsheet accounting view of the world that, oh, atoms arranged in rows and columns, that's that is the symbolism and the logic of accountancy.
Mm,
Which is okay. It's fine to have a budget and to know the inflows and outflows of cash so we don't go broke. But that's not the fundamental nature of life. And the crazy thing is the periodic table is only arranged in rows and columns because we cheated. We put gaps in some of the rows and scooched around some of the columns and so on to make it look a lot more ordered than it is. So even atoms are more kind of chaotic and delightfully non-spreadsheet like than the periodic table suggests.
yeah, thank you for sharing that fact. That's a good one. But I share your sentiment there. I think that that kind of ledger book, mechanized, atomized view of the world is very problematic in many ways. The idea as a metaphor has utility, but I think we take it too far and we think that the world is actually like that when
Mhm.
it's far more mysterious, far more messy, far more paradoxical and relational. And I feel like we could dig into those things forever. And I would like to, but I know that I also want to talk about your book that you have coming out. So I want to make room for that because you have a book coming out about flowers, which is a fascinating topic. And I'm wondering what the inspiration for that was and what it's been like
Yeah.
writing about that and getting to know these creatures.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. The inspiration is partly it's like, who doesn't need more flowers in their life right now? I mean, seriously, we flowers tell this an alternative narrative about power and control and revolution, right? So particularly here in the US, but not only in the US, the dominant narrative from the government is that we're gonna change things through violence and very kind of masculine control, top down. Whereas flowers, I mean, we think of flowers as ephemeral. Yeah, they're pretty and ornamental, but, they're not really particularly powerful. In fact, when flowering plants evolved on this planet, within a few million years, they had completely changed the whole planet. So they truly are revolutionaries.
Hmm.
And this book is telling the story of how plants made our world. I mean, that's literally the title of the book, How Flowers Made Our World. And flowers are late arrivals on the Earth stage, right? They evolved maybe 120, maybe 200 million years ago. They were complex animals. The land plants had been around for hundreds of millions of years before that. So they're late arrivals. Boom, they arrive and they change everything. So, for example, there were no rainforests before flowering plants. There were no prairies before flowering plants, no seagrass meadows or mangroves. So it's not just the land that they changed, but they actually changed the oceans as well.
Hmm.
And there would be no humans without them because we are grassland species, right? We came out of the forest to forage on grasslands. And grasses are flowers. And even before that, our ancestors, the primates, they evolved mostly to go up into flowering plant trees and eat fruit and eat the insects that were feeding on those trees. So no flowers, no humans either. So they're kind of important. And so my book is trying to put them back at the center of the story of how the earth came to be and give them some more respect. Each chapter focuses on a different flower and talks about some of the cool ways that they changed the world and continue to run the world. And one of those is, and a really important one, is using experiences of beauty to mediate cooperation. So instead of revolution through violence, it's revolution through beauty and working together. I mean,
Hmm.
and that sounds like the most naive kind of like
Flower
just,
power.
yeah. I mean, and even flower power denoted passivity, which is actually not what flowers do. They're very active. And I got nothing against flower power and all of that. Although I mean, it was a particular cultural moment that we look back on with mixed feelings. But for flowers themselves, before flowers evolved, most insects were just a pest for plants. They eat the leaves and they suck the juice out of your plant veins and all the rest. And then flowers flip the narrative. It's like, we're going to make petals and aromas and we're going to give the insects nectar and we're going to turn our former enemies into these solicitous, hardworking allies that are going to help us be more efficient pollinators. And then the insects also benefit from this. And then through this back and forth, we get whole dynasties of insects that evolve, like bees and butterflies didn't exist before flowers. And so they evolved specifically to work with flowering plants.
Hmm.
And so this huge network of flowering plants working with insects, but also birds as fruit dispersers and pollinators, and then later on bats, the other pollinating and fruit dispersing animals, the Earth's productivity then increased, and we got the evolution of things like rainforests and prairies, some of the most productive habitats on the planet today. So flowers really have these superpowers. And I want to celebrate that and also ask, what can we learn from this very time-tested method of success, right? It's not that we humans are flowers, but maybe we could learn a thing or two about what it means to change the world in a way that actually creates opportunities for other beings. Because you get a rainforest or a prairie, it's not just the flowering plants and their pollinators that benefit. There are tens of thousands, in fact, actually millions of other species that benefit from that in an indirect way. So the inspiration is partly I just think flowers are amazing and their story needs to be told more in a celebratory way. Because you go to most natural history museums now, for example, flowers barely get a mention.
Hmm.
And it's all about the dinosaurs and blah, 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 which is great. People want to see dinosaurs, but let's also say that, the age of so-called dinosaurs was actually the age when flowering plants evolved and the planet has never again been the same. So it's just a celebration of, so beauty and cooperation is part of it. Inner transformation is another. Flowers, it turns out, are really good at genetic overhauls and innovation. So they're very nimble in terms of moving their genes around and doubling the genome, then shrinking it back down so that they can adapt to new habitats. So when calamities happen, like a meteorite hits the earth, or there's a lot of volcanoes that wipe out a lot of species, flowering plants, a lot of them got wiped out, but many of them actually then went through inner genetic change that allowed them to seize that opportunity and then thrive afterwards. And to me, that's a kind of embodied hope in that flowering plants for more than 100 million years have been uh, adapting to our planet and not just coping with change, but embracing that change and then creating opportunities for other species to also thrive.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that framing as flowers as sort of enablers, that they're there and
Mhm.
they're just, I don't know if you would call it altruistically, creating this cooperative beauty that allows other species to thrive. I'm sure it's not, I guess it's symbiotic because they're benefiting from this as well. But do you have, in the research that you've done for this book, do you have a favorite at the moment where there's one flower that just fascinates you more than the others?
Oh, there are a ton. If I may, I'll just pick a couple, but some of my favorites are the ones that subvert the story that I just told.
Hmm.
Like some of the orchids actually fool their pollinators. So it's not all cooperation, that these orchids, the shape of the flower looks just like a female wasp. And the flower produces pheromones that are just like the female wasp pheromones. And even the texture, the fuzzy texture, feels like a female wasp. So these amorous male wasps emerge in the spring and they're like, woo, here we're going to have all these love trysts. And they go and embrace the flower. But of course, it's not actually a wasp. And instead, they get a dab of pollen from the orchid dumped on their head. And then they don't learn from their mistake and they go visit another another flower. And of course, from the orchid's point of view, this is great because they've got very reliable, lust-fueled pollinators. But the males are just basically wasting their time.
Hmm.
So beauty is a mediator of cooperation. Often there's a little shadow of deception and illusion that follows. And, most flowers are pretty honest and, are offering lots of nectar and pollen, all sorts of good things for insects. But that creates an opportunity for some cheats, right? And I love those stories where there's a little twist in the tale. And, there are other deceptive flowers as well that actually kill their pollinators or offer fake food and things like that. So that's one that I think is particularly interesting. The others, these are the ones that totally blew my mind, and I didn't know much about them until I wrote the book, are the seagrasses. So these are actually not true grass plants, very, very distantly related. But these are plants that about 70 or more million years ago left the land and started growing in seawater, and they flower under the water. So these are sub-oceanic flowering plants, and it's ocean currents that carry their pollen around, and they have some little shrimp that act sort of basically like little bees. And these seagrass meadows grow, they look like grasses. They grow out on the coasts wherever there's mud or sand sediment, and they stabilize that sediment and they build the sediment. So they stabilize the seacoast and store massive amounts of carbon.
Hmm.
And I don't remember the exact statistic, but I think, per acre, they're storing 50 times more carbon than the most productive forest on land. And they store that carbon for millennia, not just for centuries. So they're real carbon champions. And the seagrass meadow is the breeding ground and the home for lots of fish and invertebrates, and birds come and feed there. So they're biodiversity hotspots as well. Their flower is the most unassuming, sort of boring, tiny little thing. You need a little hand lens to see it because it's just tiny little appendage growing out of a grass-like thing growing in the water. And yet these flowering plants are, for one thing, saving us from much of our folly in terms of climate change because they're storing carbon. And second, they're essential for many coastal ecological communities. They support the community. Seagrasses have been declining quite a bit, unfortunately, but there are some really interesting restoration efforts happening around the world to restore these habitats, which to me is just really inspiring and admirable for these creatures that honestly most people, even most biologists, have never heard of.
Yeah, I have to say that my knowledge of flowers is also pretty scant. Like I remember when I was living in California and I would take trips to Death Valley when there would be like a
Hmm.
wildflower bloom there, and
Yeah.
people would rush there to see these little flowers spring up and beautiful little violets and colors, and it was really nice. And I had this kind of experience with flowers, but that seems
Hmm.
like a pretty benign. I don't even know what they were called. So I don't. My knowledge of flowers is pretty embarrassing. I would say.
No, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. I mean, we live in a culture that doesn't really encourage the study of flowers or really know. I mean, most of us know what a rose is and a pansy and things like that, and they're really interesting plants in their own right. But the knowledge of flowering plants is not taught in schools. It doesn't really get much press time and so on. So partly, I mean, this book is a modest attempt to try and sort of nudge flowers back into our perception. Although I should say, weirdly, and this is one of the tensions in the book, our fascination with plants in our gardens, like roses and other sort of quote unquote domesticated plants, is this incredible symbiosis between human creativity and botanical abundance. But it also produces quite a bit of brokenness
Hmm.
in that the pesticides that we use to grow those plants, and that through artificial breeding, we've turned a lot of flowers that used to be really nutritious for bees and birds and other plants into, they might as well be plastic. There's no pollen, there's no nectar left. So our love of flowers through horticulture has taken some pretty twisted turns, and there's a sort of a growing movement now to sort of reclaim the productivity of native flowering plants and to use more of those in our gardens. So we're not just pleasing human aesthetics, we're actually providing something good for the rest of the habitat. And I think we can do both. There's nothing wrong with growing beautiful flowers to enrich your days and to remind you of people and the culture that you came from and so on. I don't think every plant we grow has to be native to the particular area, but the foundation of our gardens or our windowsills, or however we choose, whatever we're doing in terms of interacting with plants, should be plants that are giving something back, flowers that are giving something back to the pollinators and the caterpillars and the birds and all the other members of the ecosystem. Towards the end of the book, I visit the Brooklyn Bridge Park and the gardens in front of the Brooklyn Museum, that to me are really inspiring examples of how to meet human needs for beauty and for functional public spaces while also meeting the ecological needs of the neighborhood. And so Rashid Paulson, who's the horticulture director at the Brooklyn Bridge Park, and Rebecca McMacken, who worked at the Brooklyn Bridge Park, but also at the Brooklyn Museum, have been instrumental in helping bring these amazing gardens to life that don't, because they're in very highly trafficked places, like millions of people go to Brooklyn Bridge Park every year. It's in a way a subconscious education in how native plantings can serve the needs of humans and more than humans in ways that are just inspiring and beautiful and welcoming.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I know we're getting near the end of our time together. So there were other things we wanted to cover and dig into, and we kind of danced all over the place. And so I'll try to narrow in down on one final section here, which was something that I wanted to discuss about the difference between listening and observing. The question that I had here was, if listening became as valued in our culture as speaking, what do you think would change first? Or what would be the most dramatic change?
I think at an individual level, we would have more joyful and interesting and textured lives, right? So, I mean, we all know this from personal experience. If we are in a conversation and we're the one doing most of the talking, afterwards you feel like, A, why didn't I shut up more? B, I didn't learn anything from that, right? Because I know what I'm saying. So that listening opens us to these stories from other people, from other cultures, from other species. And so there's this personal enrichment that in a way is very selfish. It's like, wow, my life is better for that. But then, of course, that translates out to the community in that we are through listening, solidifying those connections through which information and empathy and knowledge and wisdom flow and tie us together. And by listening, the community itself is elevated. The actual outcome of that, totally dependent on what the community is, right? So the challenges and the things that are most pressing, most joyful, most broken in any particular place, differ from one place to another. And listening allows those to come out into the community so people can then work on these things to celebrate or to work together or to fix problems. So that listening is, I mean, that's the original function of sonic communication, is to knit species together into communicative networks. And without listening, we're losing out. I would say we often think of listening in the human context. I do think that as the most powerful species on the planet, we now also have a duty to listen to the more than human world, to bring those practices of listening into our classrooms, into our decision-making processes. When a corporate timber-owning company is deciding the fate of land, they should be out on the land, actually literally listening to the land, not
Yes.
because they're gonna stop logging, but because their logging might be actually better informed by the voice of the community that they're working with. So listening beyond the human, it's a duty. It will help us be better neighbors and kin, but it's also joyful, right? It connects us to the cycles of the seasons and what's happening in the neighborhood and all the sort of soap opera, the drama, the melodrama of ecology, which is just fun to know that the pileated woodpeckers are really pissed off with the Cooper's hawk today, and what's all that about, and who started nesting, and look, these little flowers there are so many of these flowers in this one patch of woods that you can hear the bees humming as you walk through the forest. Those are things that yeah, they help us tune into ecology and be better stewards, if you like. But it also just makes it worth being a human on this planet.
Incredible answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
It made me want to be in a field full of flowers and buzzing bees. That was a very visceral image there. So thank you for that. And I guess as we conclude here, I like to leave the last couple of minutes for you in case there's something that you wanted to share that we didn't find a way to include, or you have something coming up that you want people to know about, or, when the book will be available that people could find, anything like that, you have some time for that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the book comes out at the end of March, and I'd be delighted to see anyone at any of my events on my website, dghaskell.com. And hopefully the book will be a useful and fun celebration of flowers. But I guess I'd like to close with an invitation to everyone is to find that place in your neighborhood, someplace that maybe it's a tree or a little view from a window that you can look at and see the sky, and just commit to return every day or every week, whatever rhythm seems right to you, and just open your senses to that place without any expectation of discovering things, of getting enlightened or finding sacrament or anything like that. Just be present for that place, but do that repeatedly and see where that befriending of the tree or the view through your window, see where it takes you. And some people like to write notes on this. I personally like to just sit and go through all my senses. What am I smelling? What am I hearing here? What is the texture of this place on my fingertips? And I think I've used the term befriending several times. And for me, this process of opening our senses to the world is forming a friendship that will lead in unexpected ways, ways that will be different for each one of us. So that's, I guess, my closing invitation is to invite that practice into your life.
Thank you for that beautiful invitation, David. Yeah, I think befriending nature is a beautiful and important thing for us to do right now. So thank you for giving people a way that they could reacquaint themselves with nature. And thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for your books. Thank you for your projects, your essays, your podcasts, your knowledge, your insights. I feel like I could speak to you for another 2 more hours. I feel like I would have loved to dig in deeper. There's so much stuff to talk about. So maybe I could run into you again another day. That would be an honor. And this has been an honor. Thank you for passing through. And thank you again.
Thank you, Danny. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation. And thank you for elevating these stories and drawing people into conversation. It's a beautiful form of deep listening.
Thank you. Thank you for passing through today. Yeah, you, dear listener. Thank you for your support, for your attention, for spending some time with me and this episode's guest. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe, rate it, like it, tell your friends about it, buy a billboard somewhere next to a highway promoting it. I mean, I'm kidding, of course, but your support really does mean a lot to me. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time.